"Please, don't do this," but the rancher did it anyway and the county was furious. The sun was a white-hot brand against the Montana sky, burning away mercy and leaving only judgment behind. Kyle Marley had ridden out to check his eastern fence line when he saw it, a dark silhouette against the bleached horizon, wrong in the way a vulture circling is wrong. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer, a wooden frame standing alone in the prairie grass, and hanging from it, a woman. Her arms were stretched wide, bound at the wrists to the crossbeam with thick hemp rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Her body sagged forward, the full weight of her pulling against her shoulders in a way that made Kyle's own joints ache. Her toes scraped the ground, just barely, forcing her to stand on the balls of her feet or hang entirely from her arms. The pale fabric of her dress was soaked through with sweat and clung to her frame, torn at the shoulder where rough hands had secured her. Dark hair fell across her face in matted strands, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that Kyle could hear even from 20 feet away. Around her neck hung a hand-painted sign, the letters crude and angry, "Murderous, Justice of the County." Kyle pulled his horse to a stop, his weathered face going hard as stone. He was 38 years old, 15 of those years spent working this land, and he'd learned to read the Montana Territory the way preachers read scripture. He knew its storms, its droughts, its moments of terrible beauty. He'd seen justice dispensed from the end of a rope, seen cattle rustlers shot, seen men beaten within an inch of their lives for crimes real and imagined. But this wasn't justice. This was torture dressed up in Sunday clothes. "Please," the word came out as barely more than a whisper, broken by thirst and pain. The woman's head lifted just slightly, enough for Kyle to see her face. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with features drawn tight by suffering. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes, when they met his, held no hope. Only the dull acceptance of someone who'd stopped fighting. "Please, water." Kyle's jaw clenched. He'd been taught to respect the law, taught that civilization required order, that marshals' badges and court documents were what separated them from animals. His father had drilled it into him, "You don't interfere with the law, son. You let justice take its course, But whose justice? And what kind of law left a woman to die like this? Kyle swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. He could see the tracks around the frame, dozens of them. People had gathered here. People had watched her strung up like an animal and then they'd walked away, left her to the sun and the crows. "Don't." The voice came from behind him, sharp and commanding. Kyle turned to see a deputy he recognized, Tom Bridger, a weasel of a man who wore his badge like it made him king. "Marshal's orders, Marley. That woman killed a man. She's getting what she deserves." "Deserves?" Kyle's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Deserves to die of thirst in the sun? That your idea of justice, Tom? That's the law's idea of justice." Tom's hand drifted toward his gun. "You cut her down, you're interfering with a legal sentence. That makes you an outlaw same as her." Kyle looked back at the woman, at Tessa Scott, though he didn't know her name yet. Her eyes were closed now, her body trembling with exhaustion. In another hour, maybe two, she'd be past saving. The ropes would have done permanent damage to her shoulders. The dehydration would shut down her organs. She'd die here, alone, displayed like a warning to anyone who might cross County Marshal Wade Garrison. Kyle had built his ranch with his own hands. He'd weathered droughts and blizzards, fought off claim jumpers and rustlers. He'd earned his reputation as a fair man, an honest man, someone who played by the rules. But there were some rules that needed breaking. "Then I guess I'm an outlaw," Kyle said quietly. He drew his knife. Tom's gun cleared leather, but Kyle was already moving. He crossed the distance to the frame in 3 long strides, reached up, and sliced through the rope binding Tessa's right wrist. Her arm dropped like a stone, and she cried out in pain as blood rushed back into the limb. Kyle caught her weight against his shoulder, cutting the second rope even as Tom shouted behind him. "Stop right there, Marley. I mean it. I'll shoot." Kyle lowered Tessa to the ground as gently as he could, her body going limp in his arms. She was barely conscious now, mumbling something he couldn't make out. He pulled his canteen from his belt and tipped water against her cracked lips. Most of it ran down her chin, but some made it in. Her throat worked, swallowing reflexively. "Kyle Marley, you're under arrest for..." Kyle stood and turned to face Tom Bridger, and something in his eyes made the deputy take a step back. Kyle wasn't a violent man by nature, but he'd been a cavalry scout before he was a rancher, and he knew how to look dangerous when he needed to. "You want to arrest me, Tom, you go right ahead and try," Kyle said, his voice level and cold. "But this woman is coming with me. And if Wade Garrison has a problem with that, he knows where to find me." Tom's gun hand was shaking. He was a bully and a coward, the kind of man who drew his authority from the badge on his chest rather than anything inside him. "The marshal, he's gonna be furious. The whole county's gonna be furious. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Kyle replied. He bent down, lifted Tessa into his arms, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her to his horse. She was unconscious now, her head lolling against his shoulder. As gently as he could, he lifted her up and settled her across the saddle before mounting behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. Tom was still standing there, gun drawn but not aimed, his face pale with indecision. "You tell the marshal something for me," Kyle said, turning his horse toward home. "You tell him if he wants to punish someone, he can come punish me. But this woman's under my protection now. And anyone who tries to take her answers to me first." He didn't wait for a response. He nudged his horse into a steady lope, holding Tessa secure against his chest as the Montana prairie rolled out before them. Behind him, the wooden frame stood empty, ropes hanging loose in the hot wind. Kyle Marley had just crossed a line he could never uncross. He defied the county law, rescued a convicted murderess, and made enemies of the most powerful men in the territory. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he'd done the right thing. Even if it cost him everything. The ranch was still 3 miles away. Tessa's breathing was shallow and irregular. And behind them, Kyle knew, Tom Bridger was already riding hard to tell Marshal Wade Garrison that someone had finally said no. The fury was coming. Kyle could feel it like a storm on the horizon. But for now, he had a woman to save. Everything else could wait. Thanking you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's begin. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than it should have. Every mile stretched out like a sentence, every hoofbeat a word Kyle couldn't take back. Tessa's weight against his chest was barely there, she was too light, hollowed out by days of whatever hell the Garrisons had put her through before they strung her up. Her breathing rattled in her throat, shallow and uneven, and every few minutes Kyle had to check to make sure she was still alive. The Montana sun showed no mercy. It beat down on them both, turning the air thick and heavy, making his shirt stick to his back. His horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Ash, sensed the urgency and kept a steady lope despite the heat. Kyle kept one arm locked around Tessa's waist, holding her upright, while his other hand gripped the reins. Her head lolled against his shoulder, dark hair tangled and matted with dust. He'd left Tom Bridger standing there with his mouth open and his gun half-drawn, too much of a coward to actually shoot but too loyal to Wade Garrison to let this go unreported. Kyle figured he had maybe 2 hours before the marshal heard what had happened. Maybe less if Tom rode hard. That gave him a narrow window to get Tessa somewhere safe, get her some water and medical attention, and figure out what the hell he was going to do next. Because there was no going back from this. Kyle had spent 15 years building his reputation in this territory, honest rancher, hard worker, man who kept his word and paid his debts. He'd served as a cavalry scout, fought in skirmishes against raiders, earned the respect of his neighbors through sweat and blood. All of that was gone now. Burned away the moment he cut those ropes. The worst part was he didn't regret it. He should have. Any sensible man would have ridden past that frame, told himself it was county business, maybe filed a complaint with the territorial governor if his conscience bothered him enough. That's what his father would have done. That's what every voice of reason in his head had screamed at him to do. But Kyle had looked into Tessa Scott's eyes, though he still didn't know her name, and seen something that made all that careful reason crumble like dust. Not guilt. Not the cold calculation of a killer. Just exhaustion and pain and the terrible acceptance of someone who'd been judged and found wanting by a system that didn't care about the truth. So he'd drawn his knife. And now there was no going back. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a promise, weathered barn, split-rail corral, the small house he'd built with his own hands. Home. Sanctuary. At least for now. Kyle urged Ash into a faster pace, ignoring the burning in his shoulders from holding Tessa upright. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Delirious, probably. Dying, maybe. He had to get her inside. Had to get water in her, tend to the rope burns on her wrists, figure out how badly damaged her shoulders were. And then he had to prepare for Wade Garrison to come calling. Because the marshal would come. That was certain as the sunrise. And when he did, Kyle Marley would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect a woman he didn't know from a law he'd always respected. The line was drawn. Kyle had crossed it. And there was nothing left to do but stand his ground and see what came next. Kyle carried Tessa through the front door and laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the house. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. He moved quickly, muscle memory from his cavalry days taking over. Water first. Always water. He filled a tin cup from the pitcher on his washstand and knelt beside the bed, lifting her head gently. Her neck was hot to the touch, fever already setting in. He tipped small amounts of water against her lips, patient, letting her body remember how to swallow. Most of it ran down her chin at first, but gradually her throat began to work. After the third cup, her eyelids fluttered. Kyle set the water aside and examined her wrists. The rope burns were vicious, raw flesh where the hemp had cut through skin, already starting to weep. He'd seen wounds like this fester and turn gangrenous if they weren't cleaned properly. He fetched his medical kit, such as it was, and a basin of clean water. Working carefully, he cleaned the wounds with a cloth, trying to be gentle even though he knew it had to hurt. Tessa's face twitched but she didn't wake. Her shoulders were worse. He could see the unnatural way they hung, the swelling already starting. Hours suspended by her arms had done damage he couldn't fix with bandages and water. She'd need time to heal, and even then she might never have full strength back. That kind of torture left marks that went deeper than skin. He wrapped her wrists with clean strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, then covered her with a blanket despite the heat. The fever needed to break, and sometimes the body needed to sweat it out. He positioned pillows under her arms to take pressure off her shoulders, then sat back and looked at what he'd done. A strange woman in his bed. A convicted murderess, if you believed the sign they'd hung around her neck. A woman he'd stolen from the county's justice. What the hell was he thinking? Kyle stood and walked to the window, looking out across his land. The sun was starting its descent toward evening, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful and harsh, like everything out here. In the distance he could see dust rising, riders, still a ways off but coming in his direction. His jaw tightened. That would be them. Behind him, Tessa made a sound, half gasp, half sob. Kyle turned to find her eyes open, wild and unfocused, staring at the ceiling like she didn't know where she was. Her hand moved to her throat, finding the sign gone, then to her wrists, feeling the bandages. "Easy," Kyle said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're safe. You're at my ranch." Her eyes found him, and for a moment there was pure terror there. Then confusion. Then something that might have been recognition, though they'd never met before today. You cut me down." Her voice was barely a whisper, raw from screaming or thirst or both. "I did." "Why?" It wasn't gratitude in her tone. It was genuine bewilderment, like the concept of mercy was foreign to her. Kyle didn't have a good answer for that. Not one that made sense anyway. So he just said, "Because it was wrong. What they did to you was wrong." Tessa closed her eyes, and a single tear traced down her cheek. "You don't know what I've done." "Don't care what you've done," Kyle replied. "Nobody deserves to die like that." Outside, the dust cloud was getting closer. Kyle could make out individual riders now. 4 of them, maybe 5. He recognized the lead horse, Wade Garrison's black stallion. "They're coming," Tessa whispered, and the fear in her voice was so raw it made Kyle's chest tighten. "I know." He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded. "But they'll have to go through me first." The riders were close enough now that Kyle could hear the hoofbeats. He stood at the window, rifle in hand, watching Wade Garrison and his men approach. But before they arrived, he needed to know what he was protecting. He needed to know if the woman in his bed was worth dying for. He turned back to Tessa. She'd managed to prop herself up slightly against the pillows, though the effort made her wince. Her eyes were clearer now, focused, and there was something in them that looked like resignation. "Tell me," Kyle said quietly. "Tell me what happened. The truth." Tessa's laugh was bitter and broken. The truth doesn't matter out here. You know that. It matters to me. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was sincere or just another man who wanted something from her. Finally, she spoke. I worked in the land office in Helena. Just a clerk. Filing deeds, recording claims, keeping the books. Her voice was still rough, but growing stronger. 3 months ago, a federal surveyor came through. Thomas Brennan. He was checking property boundaries for the territorial government, making sure everything matched the official records. Kyle nodded, keeping his eyes on the approaching riders. They'd slowed to a walk now, maybe a quarter mile out. Brennan found discrepancies, Tessa continued. Lots of them. Deeds that didn't match the survey maps. Homestead claims that overlapped. At first he thought it was just clerical errors, but then he started digging deeper. She paused, swallowing hard. He found that someone had been forging documents. Transferring land ownership on paper while the real owners didn't even know they'd lost their claims. Hundreds of acres. Maybe thousands. Let me guess, Kyle said. Wade Garrison and his brother. Cyrus Garrison owns half the county on paper, Tessa said. Turns out most of it was stolen. Wade provided the legal cover, using his badge to intimidate anyone who questioned the transfers. Cyrus provided the money and the connections. Together they built an empire on fraud. Outside, the riders had stopped just beyond rifle range. Waiting. Kyle could see Wade Garrison dismounting, handing his reins to a deputy. Brennan came to the office late one evening, Tessa said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. He wanted to compare the original deed books with the copies. I was still there, finishing up paperwork. I heard voices in the back room, angry voices. I went to see what was happening. Her hands twisted in the blanket. Wade and Cyrus were there. They had Brennan cornered. Wade had his gun out. Kyle turned to look at her. Her face had gone pale, reliving the memory. I heard Wade say, nobody's going to believe a federal man over a county marshal. And then he shot him. Just like that. Shot him in the chest and Brennan went down. Tessa's voice cracked. I must have made a sound because they both looked at me. I ran. Got maybe 2 blocks before Wade's deputies caught me. They framed you for the murder. Planted his blood on my dress. Found witnesses who swore they saw me arguing with him earlier that day. Wade testified that I'd confessed to him, said I killed Brennan because he'd rejected my advances. The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? A county marshal against a spinster clerk. Where's Brennan's body? They buried him on Cyrus's land. Northwest corner, near the old Miller homestead. Wade said nobody would ever find him there. She met Kyle's eyes. His field notes are hidden in the land office. Behind a loose board in the records room. That's the evidence that could bring them down. That's why they needed me dead. Outside, Wade Garrison had started walking toward the house, alone, his hands visible and empty. But Kyle knew that didn't mean anything. The marshal was playing a game, and Kyle had just become a piece on the board. That's quite a story, Kyle said. It's the truth. I believe you. And surprisingly, he did. There was no calculation in her voice, no practiced quality to the telling. Just exhaustion and fear and the desperate hope that someone, finally, might listen. Wade Garrison's boots hit the porch steps. "Stay here," Kyle said. "And stay quiet." The knock on the door was polite. Almost friendly. Time to face the consequences. Kyle opened the door before Wade Garrison could knock a second time. He kept the rifle low but visible, a statement without words. The marshal stood on the porch, hat in hand, wearing the expression of a reasonable man forced to deal with an unfortunate situation. But his eyes, cold and calculating, told a different story. "Kyle Marley," Wade said, his voice carrying that practiced tone of authority mixed with false friendliness. "Hell of a thing you did today." "Don't know what you're talking about, Marshal." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, don't insult my intelligence. Tom Bridger saw you cut down my prisoner. Saw you ride off with her plain as day." He glanced past Kyle into the dim interior of the house. "I'm here to collect what's mine." "Your prisoner," Kyle repeated flatly. "That what you call a woman left to die in the sun?" "That's what I call justice for a convicted murderess." Wade's tone hardened slightly. "She killed a federal surveyor, Kyle. Thomas Brennan. Good man, doing his job. She shot him in cold blood and I have witnesses who'll testify to it. Convenient witnesses, I'd wager." "Careful." The word came out soft, but there was steel underneath. Wade took a step closer, and Kyle could see the 4 deputies still mounted behind him, hands resting casually near their guns. "You're walking a dangerous line here. Interfering with the law. Harboring a fugitive. Those are serious charges." "So is torture," Kyle said. "So is executing someone without a proper trial." "She had a trial. Judge Henderson presided. Jury convicted her in less than an hour." Wade's smile returned, sharp as a blade. "But I suppose you know better than 12 men and a territorial judge." Kyle kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. If Tessa had actually been tried and convicted, this was worse than he thought. The Garrisons hadn't just framed her, they'd run her through the entire corrupt system and come out with a legal execution order. "I want to see the court records," Kyle said. Wade laughed, genuinely amused. "You want to see the records? Well, that's rich. Since when does a rancher get to review court proceedings?" He put his hat back on, adjusting it with deliberate slowness. "Here's what's going to happen, Kyle. You're going to step aside and let me search your house. And when I find that woman, and we both know she's in there, I'm going to take her back to face her sentence. You can either cooperate, or you can join her on the gallows. Your choice. Search warrant. Don't need one. She's an escaped prisoner. She didn't escape. I took her. That makes this my problem, not hers." Wade's eyes narrowed. "You confessing to a crime, Kyle?" "I'm saying if you have a legal issue, it's with me. Not her." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Kyle could feel the weight of the deputies' attention, could sense them tensing, hands moving incrementally closer to their weapons. The air felt thick with potential violence. Finally, Wade stepped back. "You're a fool, Marley. A damn fool. That woman's got you twisted up somehow, made you think she's innocent. But she's not. She's a killer and a liar, and you're throwing away everything you've built for her. If she's guilty, let the territorial court retry her. Let the U.S. Marshal's office review the case. The U.S. Marshal doesn't have jurisdiction here. Brennan was a federal employee. That gives them jurisdiction. Wade's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed facade. You're making a mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. The marshal turned and walked back toward his horse, his movements controlled but radiating barely suppressed fury. He mounted smoothly, then looked back at Kyle with an expression that promised consequences. I'll be back tomorrow morning with a warrant. For both of you. Harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice, interfering with a lawful execution. He paused. And Kyle? My brother Cyrus sits on the Territorial Council. He appoints the judges. So when you talk about courts and justice, remember who controls them. I'll remember, Kyle said quietly. Wade wheeled his horse around. Enjoy your night, Marley. It's the last free one you'll have. The 5 riders turned and rode off, kicking up dust that hung in the evening air like a threat. Kyle stood on the porch until they disappeared from view, then finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Behind him, he heard Tessa's voice, weak but determined. You should have let him take me. Kyle turned to find her standing in the doorway, pale and swaying but upright. Too late for that now, he said. He'll destroy you. Probably. Kyle looked out at the darkening prairie. But I've got until morning to figure out what to do about it. Kyle helped Tessa back to the bed, though she resisted, insisting she could stand on her own. She couldn't. Her legs gave out halfway across the room and he caught her, feeling how her whole body trembled with exhaustion. Whatever strength had gotten her to the doorway was spent. You need to rest, he said, easing her down onto the mattress. We need to run. Tessa's eyes were fierce despite her weakness. You heard him. Cyrus Garrison controls the judges. They'll have that warrant by morning, and it won't matter what the truth is. They'll hang us both. Kyle moved to the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. She was right, of course. He'd known it the moment Wade mentioned his brother's influence. The Garrisons had built their empire carefully, buying loyalty and power in equal measure. Every official in the county either worked for them or was too scared to stand against them. The territorial capital, Kyle said, thinking out loud. Helena. That's 3 days hard riding. The U.S. Marshal's office is there, Tessa said. If we could reach them, if I could testify about what I saw. If we could prove Brennan's murder, prove the land fraud. Kyle turned back to face her. You said his field notes are hidden in the land office. Behind a loose board in the records room. But Wade will have men watching that building. We'd never get in. Kyle paced the small room, his mind working through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. Running straight for Helena was suicide. Wade would have riders after them within hours, and they knew this territory better than anyone. Tessa could barely sit up, let alone endure 3 days in the saddle. And even if they made it, would the U.S. Marshal believe them without evidence? The body, Kyle said suddenly. You said they buried Brennan on Cyrus's land. Northwest corner, near the old Miller homestead. You want to dig up a corpse? Tessa's voice held equal parts disbelief and horror. I want proof. Something we can bring to the federal authorities that they can't ignore. He stopped pacing, facing her directly. A missing federal surveyor. A body buried on land owned by the county marshal's brother. That's enough to force an investigation, even if we can't get the field notes. Cyrus's men patrol that property. And even if we found the grave, how would we transport? She stopped, seeing the look on his face. You're not suggesting we actually dig him up and bring him with us. I'm suggesting we mark the location, document it somehow, then ride for Helena and bring the authorities back to find him themselves. Kyle rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble there. But you're right about the timing. We can't wait until morning. Wade wasn't bluffing about that warrant. So we leave tonight. Before dawn. Give you a few more hours to rest and regain some strength. I'll pack supplies, saddle fresh horses. He looked at her critically. Can you ride? I'll have to. Kyle nodded, appreciating her grit even if he doubted her body could deliver on her determination. There's a creek that runs north from here, Rocky Bottom. We'll ride in the water for the first few miles, make it harder for them to track us. Then we'll cut west toward Cyrus's land, find that grave, and turn north for Helena. They'll figure out where we're going. Probably. But they'll expect us to run straight for the capital. Going west first might buy us some time. He pulled out his saddlebags and started gathering supplies, jerky, hardtack, a canteen, ammunition. The bigger problem is that Cyrus has friends in Helena too. The Territorial Council. The judges. We can't just show up and hope someone listens. What about the army? Tessa asked. Fort Harrison is near Helena. Federal troops answer to Washington, not the territorial government. Kyle paused, considering. That could work. If we can get to the fort, request military protection while we present our case to the U.S. Marshal. He looked at her. You're sure about this? About what you saw? Because once we start this, there's no going back. We'll be fugitives until we either prove you're innocent or we're caught. I'm sure. Tessa's voice was steady. I watched Wade Garrison murder a man in cold blood. I won't let him get away with it. Then we leave in 3 hours. Try to sleep if you can. What about you? Kyle checked his rifle again, then his pistol. I'll keep watch. Make sure Wade doesn't decide to come back early. Outside, the Montana night settled in, vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there, Wade Garrison was planning his next move. Somewhere in Helena, Cyrus Garrison was pulling strings and calling in favors. And somewhere between here and the territorial capital lay 3 days of open country where anything could happen. Kyle had crossed the line in the dust when he cut Tessa down. Now he was about to burn the bridge behind him. He just hoped they'd live long enough to reach the other side. They left in the hours before dawn, when the world existed in shades of gray and the stars still burned cold overhead. Kyle had saddled his best horses, Ash for himself and a sturdy mare named Copper for Tessa. He'd packed light but smart, food, water, ammunition, and a bedroll. Everything else they'd have to leave behind. Tessa mounted with grim determination, though Kyle could see the pain in every movement. Her shoulders were stiff, her wrists wrapped in fresh bandages under her sleeves. She wore men's clothes he'd found for her, trousers, a shirt, a jacket against the morning chill. Her dark hair was tied back in a rough braid. You ready? Kyle asked. No, she said honestly. But let's go anyway. They rode north first, into the creek like Kyle had planned, the horses' hooves splashing in the shallow water. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Kyle kept them in the creek for nearly an hour, until the first gray light began to break in the east, then turned them west onto rocky ground that would hide their tracks. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they'd put maybe 10 miles between themselves and the ranch. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The Montana landscape opened up before them, rolling prairie broken by stands of pine, distant mountains purple against the sky. It was beautiful in a way that could break your heart, vast and indifferent to human struggles. Kyle had always loved this land, but now he saw it differently. Every ridge was a place for ambush. Every distant dust cloud might be pursuers. Every open stretch left them exposed. How long before they come after us? Tessa asked around mid-morning. They'd stopped briefly to rest the horses and she'd managed to drink some water, though she'd refused food. They're already coming, Kyle said, scanning the horizon behind them. Wade probably had men watching the ranch. They would have seen us leave. Then why haven't they caught us? Because they don't know where we're going yet. They'll split up, send riders in different directions, wait for someone to pick up our trail. He helped her back into the saddle. We've got maybe a 6-hour lead. Maybe less. They rode through the morning, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. Tessa didn't complain, though Kyle could see her swaying in the saddle, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. Around noon, she finally spoke. Why did you do it? Really? Her voice was quiet, nearly lost in the sound of hoofbeats. You didn't know me. You didn't know if I was innocent. Why risk everything? Kyle was quiet for a long moment, watching the land roll past. My father was a lawman, he said finally. Town sheriff back in Kansas. He believed in the system, in judges and juries and doing things by the book. He used to say that law was what separated us from animals. Sounds like a good man. He was. Until the railroad came through. Kyle's voice went flat. They wanted the land where our town sat. Offered to buy everyone out, but some folks didn't want to sell. So the railroad found a judge who ruled in their favor, found a sheriff who enforced the ruling, and anyone who resisted got arrested or worse. What happened? My father tried to fight it. Went to the territorial authorities, wrote letters to Washington. Nobody cared. The railroad had money and influence. Kyle paused. They found him in his office one morning. They called it suicide. Tessa said nothing, but he could feel her attention on him. After that, I stopped believing that having a badge made someone right. Started believing that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. He looked at her. When I saw you hanging there, I saw what happens when people with power decide they can do whatever they want because nobody will stop them. I'm sorry about your father. I'm sorry about Brennan. Kyle turned back to watch their back trail. But we're going to make this right. We're going to. He stopped. In the distance, maybe 3 miles back, a thin line of dust rose against the sky. Riders. Moving fast. They found us, Tessa said, her voice tight. Kyle nodded grimly. We need to move. Now. They kicked their horses into a gallop, the landscape blurring around them. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger. The posse was gaining ground, and Kyle knew their horses were fresher, their riders not injured or exhausted. This was going to be close. There. Tessa pointed ahead to a line of trees marking a river. We can lose them in the water. Kyle didn't answer, just urged Ash faster. They had maybe 10 minutes before the posse would be in rifle range. 10 minutes to reach cover. The horses thundered across the prairie, foam flecking their necks. Tessa leaned low over Kappa's mane, moving with the horse despite her injuries. Whatever softness she'd had as a land office clerk was gone now. She rode like she'd been born to it. The trees grew closer. 5 minutes. 4. Behind them, Kyle heard the first gunshot, a distant crack that sent birds exploding from the grass. Too far to be accurate, but close enough to matter. Almost there, he shouted. They plunged into the tree line, crashing through brush, and suddenly they were at the river's edge, a wide, fast-moving current that looked deep and dangerous. Can you swim? Kyle asked. Tessa's face was set with determination. Guess we'll find out. Kyle didn't give Tessa time to reconsider. He drove Ash straight into the river, feeling the cold water surge around his legs as the horse fought the current. Behind him, he heard Kappa's splash and Tessa's sharp intake of breath as the icy water hit her. The current was stronger than it looked. Ash swam hard, angling downstream, and Kyle could feel the horse struggling against the pull. He glanced back to see Tessa clinging to Kappa's mane, her face set with determination even as the river tried to sweep them away. The horses were strong swimmers, but the weight of riders and gear made every yard a battle. Gunshots cracked from the bank they'd just left. Kyle saw Wade's men burst through the tree line, 5 riders pulling up at the water's edge. One of them raised his rifle, aiming carefully. Down! Kyle shouted. They both flattened against their horses' necks as bullets kicked up spray around them. The current carried them downstream, putting distance between them and the shooters, but Kyle knew they'd follow. Wade Garrison wasn't the type to give up. It took 5 agonizing minutes to reach the far bank. Kyle hauled himself up first, then reached down to help Tessa. She was shaking, from cold or exhaustion or fear, probably all 3. Her bandages were soaked through, and he could see pink staining the cloth where her wounds had reopened. "Can you ride?" he asked, already knowing what her answer would be. "I can ride." They mounted again, water streaming from their clothes, and pushed into the thick forest on this side of the river. Kyle knew this area, had hunted here years ago. There was a game trail that wound north through dense pine, too narrow for riders to move quickly. It would slow the posse down, buy them time. Behind them, he heard shouting and splashing as Wade's men entered the water. They had minutes at best. The game trail was barely visible, overgrown with brush and deadfall. Kyle led them through at a careful pace, ducking under low branches, weaving between trees. Tessa followed close behind, moving on instinct now, her body operating on pure will. After an hour, Kyle found what he was looking for, a rocky outcrop where the trail split 3 ways. He dismounted and led Ash onto the rocks, gesturing for Tessa to follow. They picked their way carefully across the stone, then took the leftmost trail, the one that curved back east before turning north again. "Old cavalry trick," Kyle explained quietly. "Confuse the trail, make them waste time figuring out which way we went." They rode until sunset, pushing through country that grew rougher and more remote. Kyle's shoulders ached from tension. His clothes had dried stiff with river water. Every sound made him reach for his rifle. As darkness fell, they finally stopped in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine. No fire, too risky. They tied the horses where they could graze and collapsed against a fallen log. Tessa's hands shook as she tried to unwrap her bandages. Kyle moved to help her, working by moonlight to examine the damage. The rope burns had opened up again, angry and raw. "We need to clean these," he said, pulling out his canteen. "We need to keep moving." In the dark. On exhausted horses. Kyle shook his head. "We'll rest a few hours. Leave before dawn." Tessa didn't argue, which told him how spent she really was. He cleaned her wounds as best he could and wrapped them with the last of his clean cloth. His own body ached in a dozen places, old cavalry injuries that reminded him he wasn't as young as he used to be. "How far to Helena?" Tessa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Day and a half if we push hard." Kyle looked up at the stars visible through the pine canopy. "Assuming we don't run into more trouble. They'll catch us before then." "Maybe." He settled back against the log, rifle across his lap. "But we've got one advantage. Wade's been chasing us all day. His horses are tired too. He'll have to rest them or they'll break down. And if he doesn't care about the horses?" Kyle didn't answer. They both knew Wade Garrison would push until something, or someone, broke. They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Somewhere an owl called. The horses shifted and snorted softly. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. "Tell me about your ranch," Tessa said suddenly. "What you're giving up for this." Kyle was quiet for a moment. 15 years of work. Small place, but mine. Good water, decent grazing. Built the house myself, every board and nail. He smiled without humor. "Probably burning right now. Wade's not the forgiving type." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I made my choice." He looked at her in the moonlight, this woman he'd known for barely a day, who'd already cost him everything. Besides, some things are worth more than property. Like what? Like being able to look at yourself in the mirror. Kyle shifted, adjusting his position against the log. "My father spent his whole life believing in the system, and it got him killed. I won't make that mistake. Won't stand by and watch injustice just because it's wearing a badge." Tessa was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Kyle Marley. For seeing me as a person, not just a problem or a prisoner or a—" "Don't," he said gently. "You don't owe me thanks. You just owe me the truth when we get to Helena. Can you do that? Every word of it. Then that's enough." He stood, wincing at the protest from his back. "Get some rest. I'll take first watch." But as he stood guard in the Montana darkness, listening for sounds of pursuit, Kyle wondered if they'd even make it to Helena. Wondered if truth would be enough. Wondered what price they'd both pay before this was over. The territorial capital was still a day away. Wade Garrison was closer. They rode into Helena just after noon on the second day, their horses stumbling with exhaustion and their own bodies not much better. Kyle's eyes burned from lack of sleep and constant vigilance. Tessa swayed in her saddle, held upright by sheer force of will. They'd pushed through the night, knowing Wade's posse was somewhere behind them, knowing their lead was measured in hours, not days. The territorial capital was bigger than Kyle remembered, bustling streets, brick buildings, the trappings of civilization that felt alien after days in the wilderness. People stopped to stare at them as they passed, two ragged riders on exhausted horses, covered in trail dust and desperation. The U.S. Marshal's office sat on the main street, a solid building with federal flags hanging limp in the still air. Kyle dismounted and had to catch Tessa as her legs gave out beneath her. She clutched his arm, forcing herself upright. "I can walk," she insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. Kyle half carried her up the steps and through the door. The office was cool and dim after the bright street, and for a moment Kyle couldn't see anything. Then shapes resolved, a desk, filing cabinets, and behind the desk, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing federal law. "Help you?" The U.S. Marshal's voice was flat, professional, giving nothing away. "My name is Kyle Marley. This is Tessa Scott. We need to report a murder and a conspiracy involving." The door burst open behind them. Wade Garrison strode in, four deputies at his back, all of them armed and ready. Wade's face was flushed from hard riding, his clothes dusty, but his eyes were sharp and cold. "Marshal Hendricks," Wade said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm County Marshal Wade Garrison. These two are fugitives. The woman is a convicted murderess who escaped custody. The man aided her escape and is wanted for obstruction of justice." Marshal Hendricks stood slowly, his hand drifting to the gun at his hip. "That's quite an entrance, Marshal. You want to calm down and explain what's happening here?" "What's happening is that I've been chasing these criminals across Montana for 2 days. Wade pointed at Tessa. "She was tried and convicted of murdering federal surveyor Thomas Brennan. She was sentenced to death, and this man," he jabbed a finger at Kyle, "cut her down before the sentence could be carried out." "That true?" Hendricks asked Kyle. "It's true I cut her down. But the rest is lies." Kyle kept his voice steady, feeling the weight of Wade's deputies behind him. "Tessa Scott witnessed Marshal Garrison and his brother murder Thomas Brennan. They framed her to keep her quiet." Wade laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Listen to yourself, Marley. You're accusing a county marshal and a territorial councilman of murder based on what? The word of a convicted killer." "Based on the evidence," Tessa said, her voice stronger than Kyle expected. She stepped away from his support, standing on her own despite the trembling in her legs. "Thomas Brennan discovered that Wade and Cyrus Garrison have been forging land deeds, stealing homestead claims. I witnessed Wade shoot him when he confronted them about it." "She's delusional," Wade said dismissively. "Been saying crazy things since we arrested her. Probably why she killed him in the first place, couldn't handle being rejected." Marshal Hendricks held up a hand. Everyone stopped talking. He looked at Wade. "You say she was tried and convicted?" "By Judge Henderson. Full jury trial. All legal and proper." "And you," Hendricks turned to Tessa, "you're saying you witnessed this marshal commit murder?" "Yes, sir. In the Helena Land office. 3 months ago." "Where's Brennan's body?" Tessa didn't hesitate. "Buried on Cyrus Garrison's property. Northwest corner, near the old Miller homestead. His field notes documenting the land fraud are hidden in the land office, behind a loose board in the records room. Wade's jaw tightened, just for a second, but Kyle saw it. The first crack in his composure. Hendricks sat back down, his eyes moving between the two groups. This is a hell of a situation. A county marshal with a legal warrant against a convicted fugitive. But also accusations of murder against a federal employee, which gives me jurisdiction. He drummed his fingers on the desk. Here's what's going to happen. Nobody's getting arrested right now. Not until I sort this out. Marshal Hendricks, Wade's voice took on a dangerous edge. With all due respect, you're interfering with county business. I have legal authority. And I have federal authority, Hendricks cut him off. Which trumps yours when it involves one of our surveyors. So you're going to stand down while I investigate. Wade's hand moved toward his gun. His deputies tensed. The room went very quiet. Don't, Hendricks said softly. His own gun was already out, leveled at Wade's chest. Kyle hadn't even seen him draw. You really want to pull iron on a federal marshal in his own office? Because that's how this ends, with you in chains. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Wade slowly lifted his hands away from his weapon. Smart, Hendricks said. He looked at Tessa. You say the body's on garrison land and the notes are in the land office. If you're lying, you hang for murder, and he, nodding at Kyle, hangs for helping you. If you're telling the truth, we'll see where this goes. Those terms acceptable? Yes, sir, Tessa said. Then we ride out tomorrow morning. All of us. Hendricks holstered his gun. Until then, everyone stays here in Helena where I can keep an eye on you. Wade's smile was cold. Of course, Marshal. Happy to cooperate with a federal investigation. But Kyle saw the calculation in Wade's eyes, saw the way his deputies exchanged glances. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride out to Cyrus Garrison's land the next morning felt like a funeral procession. Marshal Hendricks led with 4 federal deputies, all armed and watchful. Kyle and Tessa rode in the middle, still exhausted but standing witness. Wade and his men brought up the rear, silent and tense as coiled snakes. Tessa guided them to the northwest corner of the property, to a stand of cottonwoods near what had once been the Miller homestead. Now it was just foundation stones and memories. She pointed to a spot between 2 trees where the ground looked slightly sunken, slightly different from the earth around it. There, she said quietly. The deputies dug while everyone else watched. It didn't take long. 3 feet down, they hit something that wasn't dirt. One of the deputies looked up at Hendricks and nodded grimly. Kyle watched Wade's face drain of color. Watched Cyrus Garrison, who'd ridden out from Helena to protest this violation of his property, go very still and very pale. They pulled Thomas Brennan's body from the ground wrapped in canvas, 3 months dead but preserved enough by the Montana soil. And tucked inside his jacket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was his field journal. Marshal Hendricks opened it carefully, flipping through pages of measurements, notes, and detailed documentation of forged deeds. Property transfers that had never been authorized. Homestead claims that had been stolen through fraud. Names, dates, amounts. All in Brennan's careful handwriting. Sweet Jesus, Hendricks said softly. He looked at Wade Garrison. You want to tell me how a federal surveyor ended up buried on your brother's land with evidence of massive land fraud in his pocket? Wade's hand moved toward his gun. He never cleared leather. Hendrix's deputies had their weapons out and aimed before Wade's fingers touched the grip. For a moment it looked like Wade might try anyway, might go down shooting rather than face what was coming. But then his shoulders sagged and his hand fell away. "It was business," Cyrus said suddenly, his voice desperate. "Just business. We were consolidating holdings, streamlining the process." Brennan didn't understand. "Shut up," Wade snapped at his brother. But it was too late. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Hendrix gestured to his deputies. "Wade Garrison, Cyrus Garrison, you're under arrest for the murder of federal surveyor Thomas Brennan and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government. You'll be transported to Fort Harrison to await trial in federal court." The deputies moved in with iron shackles. Wade fought, shouting about jurisdiction and corruption in kangaroo courts, but it was the sound of a drowning man grasping at nothing. Cyrus just stood there, watching his empire crumble into dust. They found the field notes in the land office that afternoon, exactly where Tessa said they'd be. More evidence. More names. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had imagined. Dozens of fraudulent claims, hundreds of acres stolen, and enough money to buy half the territorial government. It took 3 weeks for the trials. Federal prosecutors came from Washington. Witnesses were called. The evidence was presented in meticulous detail. Wade Garrison was convicted of murder and conspiracy. Cyrus Garrison was convicted of fraud and accessory to murder. Both were sentenced to hang. All charges against Tessa Scott were dropped. Judge Henderson, who'd presided over her original trial, quietly resigned and left the territory. 2 of Wade's deputies were arrested as accomplices. The rest scattered like birds before a storm. Kyle and Tessa rode back to the ranch on a cool morning in late September, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Kyle half expected to find his house burned, his cattle scattered, everything he'd built destroyed in retribution. Instead, he found his neighbors had kept watch. Had fed his animals and maintained his property. Had waited to see if the man who'd stood up to the Garrisons would come home. They rode through the gate together, and Kyle felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in weeks. Home. Still standing. Still his. Tessa dismounted carefully. Her wounds had healed, but she still moved with caution, and looked around at the small ranch with something like wonder in her eyes. "It's not much," Kyle said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's honest," Tessa replied. "It's yours because you built it, not because you stole it." She turned to face him. "What happens now?" Kyle had been asking himself that question for 3 weeks. He'd saved her life, yes. Had helped bring down corrupt officials and exposed a massive fraud. But what came next? She was free now. Could go anywhere, do anything. "I could use help running this place," he said carefully. "If you're interested. Fair wages, your own room. No obligations." Tessa smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Just business partners." "To start with," Kyle said, feeling heat rise to his face. "And then, we'll see. If you want." "I want," she said quietly. Then she stepped forward and did something that surprised them both. She kissed him. Just briefly, just softly, but enough to seal a promise neither of them had quite put into words yet. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. I never thanked you properly. For seeing me. For believing me when nobody else would. You thanked me by telling the truth, Kyle said. By being brave enough to stand up and testify even when you were terrified. That took more courage than anything I did. They stood there in the Montana sunlight, two people who'd survived corruption and violence and a desperate chase across the territory. Who'd found justice when justice seemed impossible. Who'd found each other in the worst circumstances imaginable. The ranch wasn't much. Just a small house, some livestock, and a piece of land. But it was theirs now. Built on honesty instead of fraud. Held together by courage instead of fear. Kyle looked at Tessa and saw his future. Saw seasons passing, saw the ranch growing, saw a life built on truth and hard work and the kind of love that comes from truly knowing someone. Welcome home, he said. And for the first time in a very long time, Tessa Scott smiled like she believed it. Sometimes justice only happens 'cause one stubborn soul refuses to look away from someone else's pain. Sometimes the person everyone calls a thief is the only one brave enough to tell the truth. If you had ridden past that lonely frame that day, would you have cut Rose down knowing trouble would come hunting you next? Have you ever seen something wrong and had to decide whether to stay quiet or stand up? If this story stirred something in you, tap like so more folks can find it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ride out into the Old West with us. And before you go, pour yourself another cup of coffee or tea and tell me in the comments what time is it right now and where are you listening.